to Fantastic History. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Clay.
We're a husband and wife duo who enjoy telling each other about amazing events, people, and mysteries throughout history. Well, I bet you thought you'd seen The Last of Us.
Ha ha ha.
You know, sometimes life happens, but you know what else life does? Life finds a way. We're back, baby.
We are.
We're back. We've missed you.
Yeah, we've had a little hiatus. If you're listening to this in the far future, then you have no idea what we're talking about. But yeah, we had to take a little break, and this is our first episode back after that break. So this is sort of a season 2, I suppose you could say.
Season 2 or a soft reboot. Like, really, whatever you're more comfortable with, I guess.
If it was a soft reboot, we'd be replaced with younger people.
Oh, ew. No. Yeah, that's a good point, though.
Yeah.
But it's also kind of weird to think, like, 85 episodes as season 1. Like,
It's true. We did make it a long time.
we did. So, you know what? Good for us. But enough with all the sentiment. Let's jump right in. You guys have waited long enough. So the big news is that during the hiatus between season 1 and season 2, I published one of my books.
That's right.
Oh my God. It's a contemporary romance called Between the Lines, and it is set in nearby Asheville, North Carolina. So to celebrate and kind of honor that, I thought like I'd bring us back in with a story about another author who has ties to Asheville.
Okay.
Clay, have you ever heard of F. Scott Fitzgerald?
Sounds so vaguely familiar, but I couldn't say. But seriously, yes.
Yeah, of course. I mean, like anybody who's ever attended an American high school has read The Great Gatsby. Like, there's no one our age who has not been forced to read it.
Or at least seen it on a summer reading list.
Right.
Or on a bookshelf many a time.
Yeah, like you would definitely recognize that cover. The dark blue and the disembodied eyes with the glasses.
Yeah.
Like, you know the cover. Well, it happens to be one of my favorite books of all time. Like, I'd say it's probably in my top 5 and possibly even in my top 3. The Great Gatsby. So, like, for almost 2 decades, I reread it every summer. I am obsessed with Gatsby. And the other work of Fitzgerald's that I've read, like, it's also fantastic, but, like, Gatsby is the one. And, like, for me, it's not even close.
Did we accidentally change into a F. Scott Fitzgerald appreciation podcast?
I kind of thought now was the right time.
Okay, we
Like,
pivoted, folks.
Yeah, so season 1, a fantastic history. Season 2, fantastic Scott.
Great Scott.
Oh, it was right there. And it's even called Great Gatsby. And I didn't get Great Scott, really.
Well, I thought you'd at least go fantastic Fitzgerald.
God, I'm rusty. I'm not doing great, guys. I'm so sorry.
We're getting back into the groove.
I'm gonna have to move on from that.
Yeah.
So what's interesting about The Great Gatsby is that it was never popular during Fitzgerald's lifetime. It was considered like a pretty big flop. In fact, it wasn't until World War II that it started really gaining traction because the military was handing out books to the troops for free so they could have something to occupy their downtime.
Sure.
They made these like fairly small paperback editions of several like distinctly American books, including The Great Gatsby. Those copies made it through the American troops, and some copies got passed off to their allies, and then soldiers started writing back home about this incredible book. They just like, oh my gosh, you guys have to read this. This book was considered like an embarrassing and like kind of massive failure at the time of Fitzgerald's death in 1940, just before his masterpiece finally started gaining traction. Like, you hate to see it. Now, let me ask you another question that is like imperative to this story. How much do you know about Zelda Fitzgerald?
I'd say very little.
Okay. I think for most people, if you know anything about her beyond the fact that she was F. Scott Fitzgerald's wife, it's probably just that she struggled with her mental health. for the vast majority of her life.
Yeah.
It was those struggles that brought the Fitzgeralds to Asheville in the mid-1930s.
Oh, really?
Yeah, oh, yes. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Like, we're not going to jump right into that because, like, you really need to understand what their lives were like, what their marriage was like to kind of know how we ended up here. So Scott Fitzgerald met Zelda Sayre in 1918 when she was 18 years old and he was 21. In a move that may sound a touch familiar to anyone who's read The Great Gatsby recently, Scott had recently been dumped by Ginevra King, the woman he loved, because he wasn't rich enough. So he dropped out of school and voluntarily joined the army, even with World War I raging in Europe. For the rest of his life, every time Ginevra's name was mentioned, he would get tears in his eyes. She was his Daisy. Like, no question about it. Fortunately, or not, he was stationed just outside of Montgomery, Alabama, which just so happened to be where the socially prominent Sayre family lived. Like, I don't want to ignore this or sweep it under the rugs. Like, I'm just going to put it out there. Zelda and her family were Confederate sympathizers who were extremely proud of their ancestors who'd served on the wrong side of the Civil War. It's like, that has no real relevance to the story per se, but I just like want to make sure everybody has all the info before they start glamorizing anybody. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So for what it's worth, Scott did not share these sentiments like at all, but Zelda was like very into it. Anyway, Scott used his downtime between courting Zelda and preparing for deployment to work on a draft of his first novel, which would come to be called This Side of Paradise. He called Zelda every day, but still wrote her letters. So, like, he was down bad for this chick. In his letters, he would talk about how he was going to be a famous novelist someday. Rather delightfully, Zelda was basically like, dude, you're full of shit. Stop making up wild things to impress me. In response, he mailed her a chapter of the draft to prove his point, and her response was, dude, you're full of shit. She thought it was genuinely awful. Awful.
His plan didn't work out so well.
No, I mean,
his courting plan kind of fell on his face.
It didn't do great, but like, he was being genuine. He was like, here's like, I'm so hype about this. Like, oh my God. And gave it to her. She's like, oh boy. Oh no. What choice did he have but to rewrite the main love interest so that she seemed pretty much exactly like Zelda? And wouldn't you know, Zelda swiftly changed her tune and decided, actually, this book rules.
Attaboy.
Uh-huh. So his courting plan worked AF.
That's good.
About 2 months into their courtship, things got serious between them, with Scott writing to one of his friends, I love her, and that is the beginning and end of everything. You're still a Catholic, but Zelda's the only God I have left now.
Oh, man.
I got chills reading that.
That's good.
Like, oh, boy. And he didn't even say that to her. He was saying that to somebody else about her. Like,
just a friend.
Oh, my God. It's like, he meant that shit. The fact that, like, you've never referred to me as the deity of any kind is actually really hurtful and offensive. Just by the way.
Busted.
Yeah, like, that's really, like, it's actually so disgusting of you. That being said, their courtship was indicative of how their life together would be. And by that, I mean, it was pretty dark. Like, the woman he'd loved before her, Zelda also didn't believe Scott would be able to support her financially, and she refused to marry him until he could prove otherwise. Once he completed the manuscript for This Side of Paradise and started shopping it around to publishers, Zelda consented to a proposal. In March of 1919, Scott gave her his mother's ring and they were officially engaged. However, when 4 months passed without him securing a publishing deal, Zelda changed her mind because she simply couldn't tie herself down to someone who couldn't keep up with her wealthy lifestyle.
Oh, boy.
In response, Scott started carrying a pistol with him every single day, prepared to complete suicide at a moment's notice.
Oh my
God. Just waiting for one thing to push him over the edge, and he was going to end it because of this. No longer worshiping at her altar, he wrote to a friend, I wouldn't care if she died, but I couldn't stand to have her marry anyone else.
He's
This is like, they've only known each other for a year.
yeah, he's dealing with some issues from his previous relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not going well.
It's not, and it won't. It won't. So yeah, like when I say their courtship was dark, like really dark.
This is like this kind of thing that you should be experiencing after you're married.
Wow, great.
This isn't the type of thing you want to be experiencing before you get married.
Yeah.
How's that going to look once you're like, oh, now we're married?
Yeah, 1,000%.
Now things are on the uptick. That's usually when the issues start to unfold.
Sure.
The courtship is supposed to be like the really good times.
Right. You're still on your best behavior, especially since you've like known each other for a year at this point. Like this is still like the best part behavior wise. And you've gone from you are God to I wish you were dead and also I'm going to kill myself. Like this is not good.
You know what might actually help them?
Therapy?
If they have a baby.
Oh, well, give us some time.
Ooh.
Yeah. As many authors do, Scott channeled his pain into his manuscript and did a final Hail Mary edit on this side of paradise. And thank God it worked. In September of 1919, Charles Scribner's sons bought the manuscript. Still, Zelda refused to marry Scott until she knew for 100% sure that this was real. Thus, F. Scott Fitzgerald's first novel was published on March 26th, 1920, and Zelda married him on April 3rd, 1920. She gave it a week. She was like, let's be sure.
She has her standards. You got to give her that.
She's she knows her worth, open parentheses, question mark. One of the many problems in their marriage, like obviously it's not going to be great, was that, well, that's really no way to start your life together. As we were just saying, like that's not a green flag, sister, like at all. By the time Zelda finally agreed to marry him, it was more about winning than it was about being in love for both of them.
Yeah.
Neither of them really seemed that into it anymore, but they did it anyway, and their relationship would have fallen apart really quickly if not for the fact that they became one of New York City's most prominent celebrity couples, like right out of the gate.
Really?
Oh, yeah. They became a package deal in the eyes of the public. Being together is what they were known for, so they stayed together.
So this book made him famous.
It got his name out there, but their antics made him famous. Is how I would kind of view it.
So they are famous at this point because of his antics.
Yes, or theirs together.
Okay.
Yeah. So like you would think that Scott would be the big celebrity in their relationship, like for that reason. Like he's the one who's published a book, and like she's just some lady. I mean, for that matter, he's like very definitely the more well-known Fitzgerald today.
Yeah.
But it was Zelda who like put them on the map. While today it's her husband that most people think of when talking about the 1920s, like I think it's safe to say most people associate Gatsby with the vibe of that entire era, the flappers in the 1920s. But at the actual time, in 1920 forward, Zelda was considered to be the first flapper.
Really?
Yes. Like in the newspapers and everything, that's how she was referred to. The first flapper, Zelda Fitzgerald. Like, oh, that was Zelda.
Can I interject real quick?
Of course.
If she was known as the first flapper, did she sort of invent the term?
No, but it was like invented in reference to her. I mean, at least I couldn't find anywhere like without tracking down incredibly old newspaper articles of the time, and like which just simply don't have the mental capacity to do right now. But it was applied towards her, and that's kind of how like one of the ladies that we had talked about in the I apologize, I can't remember her name, and I really should. The murder victim in one of the trials of the century was considered to be like the first pinup model.
Oh yeah, the Trials of the Century Part 1.
Yes. Yeah. And I think she was like the first trial that we covered. I can't remember if that one had two or it was anyway.
Yeah.
It kind of that situation where like that's how people always referred to her as like, oh, she's the flapper. She's a flapper. Oh, she's the first flapper. Blah, blah, blah. Like,
Okay.
So she was beautiful, a social butterfly, a charming Southern debutante. And she and her husband were both raging alcoholics.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. So it's the entire flapper 1920s bathtub gin, speakeasy, beaded dresses, Charleston vibe. Like it is these two people kicking it off.
Yeah.
According to Beloved Infidel, a memoir written by a woman who had an affair with Scott during his marriage, he and Zelda got into some truly wild shenanigans during this time. For example, they once jumped fully clothed into the fountain in front of the Plaza Hotel. They were also known to wave down a taxi and then insist on riding on the hood instead of getting in the car.
Wacky.
They held their sporks in the air. In another drunken escapade, they went to a morgue to look at the unidentified corpses, which, like, for me personally, that's something I could get on board with. That's an amazing date, but I can see where, like, as a pattern of behavior, it's pretty odd.
Yeah, if the other things were not present, this would not be odd.
No, like let's get wasted, swim in the fountain, hail a cab, ride on the hood to the morgue, and just like look at the dead bodies.
Yeah,
just look at them. I don't know
either.
Their marriage is pretty interesting to me in that way, where they still like they don't share romantic love anymore. But they were obviously perfect for each other. Despite that, like, it's really strange.
Yeah, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, nobody else is putting up with what each of them individually is putting up with the other person. But they're just like, and it's not even a situation where it's like, oh, we're best friends, because like they weren't. They hated it. I mean, like, he wishes she was dead and he's going to kill himself about it. And like that kind of attitude doesn't ever fully go away. But like, I don't know.
That's weird.
Very strange.
Yeah.
All of that wild behavior, though, like, again, hints at something darker. For Scott, it was crippling alcoholism. And for Zelda, it was declining mental health. Going forward, I'm going to be using some language to describe her that is like, not kind. It is not an appropriate way to discuss someone whose mental health is in decline. So just a heads up there, but there will be times where I'm using the language of that day to describe what's going on with her. So like she has all of my sympathy and kindness and goodwill in the world, but things were talked about differently 100 years ago. That being said, the first person to call her crazy was none other than Ernest Hemingway, who was a close friend of Scott's. The Fitzgeralds and Hemingway were hanging out once when Zelda started loudly proclaiming that Al Jolson was greater than Jesus Christ. Now, I'm not sure what metric she was using to make this judgment call, but she was adamant about it either way. Like, people get so up in arms about John Lennon saying the Beatles were bigger than Jesus, which was arguably true from like a statistical, like, numbers perspective. They did have more followers. But Zelda is writing this hard for a guy who wore blackface in The Jazz Singer. Okay. Oh, okay, Zelda. Yep, he's better than Jesus. I'm happy for you, honey. Hemingway, with whom she had never gotten along, told Scott to keep an eye on her after that because she was insane. In a letter to Scott not long after the Al Jolson incident, Hemingway wrote, "I thought Zelda was crazy the first time I met her, and you complicated it even more by being in love with her. And of course, you're a rummy," which is another word for alcoholic. And that kind of goes back to like all the outrageous stuff they were so famous for in New York. With Zelda's struggles and Scott's alcoholism, it's like they were always egging each other on to do more and more dangerous or absurd things. It was not a healthy environment for either of them to be in. He was later quoted as saying, "Perhaps 50% of our friends and relatives would tell you, in all honest conviction, that my drinking drove Zelda insane. The other half would assure you that her insanity drove me to drink. Neither judgment would mean anything." Yeah. Things took a turn for the somehow even worse in 1926 as their marriage further deteriorated. At a party in Paris that year, Scott was too busy talking to a dancer named Isadora Duncan to pay any attention to his wife. In order to get his attention, she intentionally threw herself down a set of marble stairs.
Oh.
Yeah. A few months later, when they were in Los Angeles and Scott was working on a movie, Zelda felt he was getting too close to one of the film's leading ladies, so she climbed into a bathtub and set her clothes on fire. As in the clothes she was wearing.
Oh.
Yeah. It's
yeah.
bad, dude.
That's bad.
It's real bad. And even then, it took another 2 years and a bizarre incident of Zelda staring at a pile of sand and being unable to speak before she was diagnosed as schizophrenic. Now, allow me to clarify this. Later research has shown she was actually bipolar. And what the examining doctor actually said to Scott was, "Your wife is mad." But the official on-paper diagnosis for her at the time was schizophrenia. Needless to say, that was even more misunderstood at that time than it is now. Even with the diagnosis, it took her attempting to drive herself, Scott, and their then 9-year-old daughter off a cliff on a homicidal whim before the Fitzgeralds actually sought treatment for Zelda. They diagnosed this woman with schizophrenia, and they were like, "Oh, well, anyway, what you want to do today?" Like,
you drive.
Yeah. Oh my God. Great.
Wow.
And that finally brings us to Asheville. Now, does anyone remember at this point that that was the theme of the episode?
I did.
Great.
I did. I was thinking, how is this going to get to Asheville? And here we are.
Here we are. So from that point onward, Zelda spent the rest of her life in and out of psychiatric facilities, ultimately winding up at Highland Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina in 1936. Scott had already spent some time in Asheville the year before, where he stayed at the Grove Park Inn in rooms 441 and 443. Now, one room was for sleeping, one room was for writing. Just if you're wondering why he had 2 rooms.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. The mountain air was said to be good for treating tuberculosis, so he told all of his friends he was going there to treat a mild case of TB. But what he was actually trying to do was lock himself away somewhere to sober up. This is kind of a sidebar, but it's so wild I have no choice but to share it. Do you know what his doctors were having him do to get him to stop drinking gin? Because it's one of those, you got ghosts in your blood, you should do cocaine about it type of medical treatments.
I can't wait.
Okay. They had this man, to cure his alcoholism, drinking upwards of 30 beers a day.
Okay, so this is like the guy who says, I'm quitting smoking. Instead of smoking cigarettes, I'm smoking cigars.
Right. Or instead of smoking cigarettes, I'm going to smoke crack. Like, it's just, this is not any better for you at all. And like, you're going to be gaining a lot of weight if you're drinking 30 beers a day. So like, you're going to be putting like different types of strain on your body. Like, what the hell are we talking about? Every now and then he'd swap out some of the beers for coffee or Coca-Cola. But for the most part, he was pounding brewskis.
That's crazy.
Now, for reference, that means he would have run through about a keg and a half by himself every week.
So was the idea that he's drinking so much hard liquor that the beer is actually less, and he'll still get drunk, but he won't get as wasted?
I don't know if the thought was that like alcohol is fine, but like liquor is bad. So, but we don't want you to have like the DTs and the shakes and whatever. You can't just stop drinking alcohol altogether because you're such an alcoholic. So we'll switch you over to beers. But make sure you're drinking 30 a day. Like, sorry?
I don't know.
I can't. I mean,
Maybe
like,
someone out there knows.
a legend during Pledge Week, but this is not healthy behavior for a grown-ass man.
Yeah.
He returned to the Grove Park Inn for that first summer that Zelda was staying at Highland Hospital. So he was there in 1935, the year before, came back in 36 while she was getting used to the hospital. On one of her days out of the facility, Scott drove her and some friends to a house in nearby Tryon to hang out. And great. Something just came over her, and Zelda opened up the door of the moving car and threw herself out of it to attempt suicide.
Mm.
After that, not only did he not take her off the hospital grounds for day trips like this, he also rarely visited her anymore because it was embarrassing.
Right.
Yeah. Not long after that, Scott invited a reporter from the New York Post to come visit him to write a piece to basically spin the whole situation to the public. Like, no, it's not that I'm a drunk and my wife is schizophrenic. Like, I'm here having a very relaxing and chill time. But that's not exactly how things went. Upon returning to New York, the journalist described Scott as a very broken man who is physically feeble and mentally very pathetic, and reaching to the highboy to have a drink, with a nurse on hand to watch him constantly because he had fired off a gun in the hotel.
Oh, God.
Uh-huh. It turned into a total hit piece. It didn't really help Scott's reputation at all that he'd been reduced to writing flash fiction for magazines instead of novels. Part of the problem was that he was having to churn out material much more quickly to keep up with Zelda's hospital bills. But another part of it was, well, it's now the middle of the Great Depression, and nobody really wanted to read about rich people doing wacky things and not having real problems, which was kind of Scott's entire shtick.
Sure. Yeah, it makes total sense.
I mean, like, if I am selling my children to have food to eat, I don't really want to read about like some really rich sad guy going to awesome parties. Like,
yeah,
no thank you. He was incapable though of writing about people who didn't have more money than God, so kind of had no choice there. Realizing that Zelda was never going to get better and he was languishing in North Carolina, Scott moved to California in 1937 to write screenplays for MGM, which is something I didn't know he did. I did not know that he was ever like a scriptwriter. Zelda stayed behind in Highland Hospital, where she received regular electroshock treatment as well as insulin shock treatment, which is something I have never heard of before doing this research.
Yeah, me either.
So this is like it was very upsetting for me to like read about this and learn about this as a type 1 diabetic who, like, I've had some very scary incidents with low blood sugar. So this is very uncomfortable and not cool. But insulin shock treatment, in case you guys don't know, because I didn't, was where they would give massive doses of insulin to non-diabetic patients specifically to put them in a coma. This was done every single day for about 2 months at a time. So they were being put into daily comas for weeks on end, although there are documented cases of this being done to some patients for upwards of 2 years. The patient would be given insulin, go unconscious for about an hour, and then be woken up with a huge injection of glucose. Most of the time while they were in a coma, they would have seizures, and that was all part of the treatment.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just I can't think of a single 20th century treatment for a mental illness that sounds more torturous than this. As someone who has experienced this, and it feels scary, and it is scary, and to be put through that every single day for months or years on purpose, I can't.
There were some pretty crazy things they did to people, and people who they thought were, just crazy.
Yeah.
And their brains were all messed up.
Yeah.
So, I've never heard of that either.
No.
That's genuinely crazy.
Yes. Yeah. Well, check out those guys, maybe. So, yeah, Scott ditched Zelda to live a glamorous Hollywood lifestyle. And meanwhile, she's back in Asheville having diabetic seizures every day as a non-diabetic. Things are going great. But it wasn't all bad. Zelda was a writer in her own right, and she was a prolific painter. And she was able to exercise both of those talents while she was in the hospital. So, like, that's cool. She also made friends easily with other patients and was a darling of the nursing staff. It's like when the hospital eventually closed down, I think it was in the late 80s or early 90s, there were nurses there still talking about her because when they were new on the job, all the nurses who were with Zelda that were still there was like, oh, you should have been here when Zelda was here. She was the best. She was so much fun. She was so funny. And so she definitely left a legacy for herself among the staff. Like she was beloved. The last time she and Scott saw each other was in the spring of 1939. The hospital arranged for a group of patients to visit Cuba together for a few days, like a little sanatorium field trip, which I did not think was a thing. Although having said that, in the book of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, I can't remember if it's in the movie, but they go on a day trip like to go fishing. And like the chief goes with them and everything, which is like you wouldn't think you'd let him leave. I don't know. But I guess that's a thing. I don't know.
Well, I mean, going on a day trip does seem a little strange, but they went to a different country.
Cuba, yeah.
That's even crazier.
Well,
like
yeah. It just like how much staff? Like, what was the staff to patient ratio?
Yeah.
Okay, well, here's the thing. Zelda missed the trip after she had an unexpected setback in her treatment. But once she'd stabilized, they were like, oh yeah, you just go with your husband and take the trip. Like just the two of you. That's fine. And then come back when you're ready. Yeah. I don't know if she just had like things get way worse for her and you see what happens when things are like really bad. Like maybe don't immediately send her off with her shitty drunk husband. I don't know. The trip was an unmitigated disaster. Like who could have known?
Right.
Scott was so drunk when they got back to America that he had to be hospitalized for weeks before going back to California.
Oh, man.
Oh, yeah.
Partying too hard in Cuba.
Yes, absolutely he did. And so he dropped her back off at Highland Hospital. They said goodbye. They never saw each other again. Because about a year later, Zelda was officially discharged from Highland Hospital, but she was put into her mother's care to start with, just because the doctors knew that her relationship with Scott was sometimes volatile. So we'll put you with your mom for a little while till you're like fully back on your feet. It'll be great. She and Scott made plans to see each other again for Christmas that year, 1940. In a letter she wrote to him a couple of weeks before they were set to reunite, she said, I am sorry that there should be nothing to greet you but an empty shell. I love you anyway. Even if there isn't any me or any love or even any life, I love you. He died of a heart attack like a day or two after he got that letter. As you might expect, his sudden death at the age of 44 had an extremely negative impact on Zelda's mental health. She was unable to attend his funeral because she was beside herself. She was also too fragile to attend their daughter's wedding a few months later. Years of shock therapy had destroyed her ability to retain memories, and she often seemed to lack emotion of any kind by this point. It became clear she needed to resume inpatient therapy. Zelda returned to Highland Hospital in 1943. 5 long years later, in early March of 1948, her doctors agreed that she was finally well enough to be discharged, but she insisted on staying a few days longer. And that is deeply unfortunate, because it meant that on the evening of March 10th, she was locked in her room, pumped to the gills with sedatives, when a fire broke out.
Oh, no.
To this day, nobody is sure if it was an accidental kitchen fire or if it was intentional arson set by a disgruntled employee, but what is known is that the fire started in the kitchen and went up the shaft of the dumbwaiter, which allowed it to spread to every floor of the hospital very quickly. To make matters worse, all of the building's fire escapes were made of wood, and they went up like a snap.
That's a really bad choice.
Really, really poor choice for a fire escape, yeah. Miraculously, only 9 patients were killed in the fire, but one of them was Zelda Fitzgerald, whose remains had to be identified by dental records. So there you have it. Asheville's ties to one of America's greatest writers. Hooray!
I want to go to bed. It's horrible. It's a horrible story.
Well, yeah, it is brutally awful. Brutally awful. If you're feeling thoroughly depressed, guys, by that, and you kind of want to purge those bad vibes, might I suggest buying a copy of Between the Lines by the great American novelist Sarah R. Chapman?
Is it a sad story or is it a happy story?
I'll say this much. It'll definitely give you a much more fun association with Asheville.
Well, then I can recommend it too.
Yeah, but you weren't going to before.
Well, some people may need a pick-me-up after a sad story.
Yeah, that's true. But you know what, guys? You'll laugh, you'll cry, you'll fall in love. And I'll just say it, if you're not familiar with the romance genre, one of the prerequisites, you cannot be considered a romance novel if it doesn't have a happily ever after. So keep that in mind. If you're feeling real sad, this will make you feel happy. It'll be great. And you can visit Malaprop's bookstore and cafe at 55 Haywood Street and pick up additional copies to give as gifts to loved ones. You can go to Asheville, see the place for yourself, and pick up a copy of the book.
Great.
Before you run out the door to go pick up your copy, I just want to say thanks for tuning in, spending a little bit of your time with us today. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Hopefully you learned something interesting today. Let's say that.
There you go.
And if you did, please take a second to rate, review, and subscribe on whatever podcast platform you use. Check us out on Instagram at FantasticHPod and on TikTok at Fantastic History Podcast. You can also shoot us a message at fantastichistorypod@gmail.com if you know of any amazing events, people, and mystery throughout history that you'd like us to cover on the show, or if you just want to say hello. Scroll on down in your app for our show notes where we have links to my sources, as well as a purchase link for my book and one for our Etsy store, where we have even more history-themed items for sale than we did last time we caught up with you. There's even a couple of Wojtek items for our longtime listeners.
Yeah.
Until next time.